They say Pennsylvania is the Keystone State, but what they don't tell you is what that keystone unlocks. Beneath the historic streets of Philadelphia, beyond the rolling hills of Amish country, and deep within the ancient forests of the Allegheny Mountains, there are doors that should never be opened. Stories that should never be told. Tonight, I'm going to tell you 3 of them. These aren't just stories. These are warnings, passed down in whispers, documented in police reports that were quickly buried, and remembered by families who wish they could forget. Before we begin, I need you to understand something. What you're about to hear happened in places you can visit, roads you can drive down, buildings that still stand. And after tonight, you'll never look at Pennsylvania the same way again. So turn off the lights, lock your doors, and whatever you do, don't stop listening until the end. Because the 3rd story, well, it might just change everything you thought you knew about what's possible. If you're ready to descend into the darkness with me, hit that like button right now. It helps more people find these stories. And trust me, you're going to want someone to talk to about this after we're done. Let's begin. The abandoned Pennhurst State School in Spring City stands as a monument to suffering. Its official closure in 1987 ended decades of documented abuse and neglect. But for Marcus Chen, a security guard hired in 2019 to watch over the decaying complex, the real horror was just beginning. Marcus had taken the night shift because it paid better. The real estate development company that owned the property needed someone to prevent vandalism and keep out urban explorers who treated the place like a haunted attraction. They told him about the history, of course, how Pennhurst had opened in 1908 as the Eastern Pennsylvania State Institution for the Feeble-Minded and Epileptic, how it had housed thousands of patients over the decades, many of them children with developmental disabilities who were abandoned by their families and forgotten by society, how conditions had deteriorated so badly that a lawsuit in 1977 had exposed horrific abuse, overcrowding, and neglect, how children had been tied to beds, left in their own filth, and subjected to experimental treatments that would be considered torture by any modern standard. It was easy money, they said. Just patrol the grounds, make sure nobody breaks in, and keep your radio on. The buildings were empty now, just brick and broken windows. Nothing to worry about. Marcus didn't believe in ghosts. He'd grown up in Philadelphia, worked security at shopping malls, office buildings, even a morgue during his college years. He'd seen plenty of strange things, encountered plenty of unstable people, but nothing supernatural. The dead stayed dead, and old buildings were just old buildings. Until the 15th night. It was on his 15th night that he first heard the children singing. The sound drifted across the courtyard around 2:47 a.m., according to the timestamp on his incident report. At first, Marcus thought it was coming from his radio, maybe some weird interference from a nearby station. But when he turned the radio off, the singing continued. A dozen young voices, maybe more, singing "Ring Around the Rosie" in perfect, haunting unison. Marcus grabbed his flashlight and followed the sound to the Mayflower Building, one of the largest dormitory structures on the campus. The front doors were chained shut, just as they'd done when he'd checked them an hour earlier. The singing was coming from inside, from somewhere on the 2nd floor. "This is security," he called out, his voice echoing across the empty courtyard. "The building is closed. You need to leave now." The singing stopped. In the silence that followed, Marcus heard something worse. Footsteps. Not the cautious footsteps of trespassers caught in the act, but the quick, light patter of bare feet on tile. Dozens of them running through the corridors above, back and forth, as if playing some midnight game of tag. Marcus radioed dispatch. "I've got multiple intruders in Mayflower. Sending me back up?" The voice that crackled back was his supervisor, Jerry, calling from the main office 15 miles away. "Negative, Marcus. We don't have anyone else on duty tonight. Can you assess the situation and report back?" "Jerry, there's got to be at least 20 people in there." 20? That's impossible. The motion sensors would have triggered. Are you sure you're not hearing things? Marcus stared at the building. Every window was dark. The chains on the door hadn't been touched. But he could still hear them, those small feet running overhead, and now, laughter. Children's laughter, high and breathless, like they were having the time of their lives. I'm going in. Marcus, wait for... He switched off the radio. The chains were secured with a padlock, but Marcus had been given a master key ring on his first day. His hand shook as he found the right key, and for a moment he considered just walking away, getting in his car, and never coming back. But he needed this job, and more than that, part of him needed to know what was happening inside. The door swung open with a groan that echoed through the empty halls. Marcus stepped inside, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air was thick with the smell of mold and decay, and something else, something sharp and chemical that reminded him of a hospital. The footsteps had stopped. "Hello?" Marcus called out. His voice sounded small in the vast emptiness of the building. "If you're in here, you need to come out now. This is private property." No response. He made his way to the stairwell, every nerve in his body screaming at him to turn back. The stairs creaked under his weight as he climbed to the second floor. The hallway stretched before him, lined with doors, most of them hanging open or missing entirely. In the beam of his flashlight, he could see institutional beds, still made up with thin mattresses, metal cabinets tipped over on their sides. And then he saw the children. They stood at the far end of the hallway, perhaps 30 feet away. 12 of them, he counted later, when he could finally bring himself to talk about it. Children ranging from maybe 6 to 12 years old, all wearing identical gray hospital gowns that hung loosely on their thin frames. They stood perfectly still, holding hands in a line that stretched across the width of the hallway, facing him. Their skin was pale, almost luminescent in the beam of his flashlight, and their hair hung lank and lifeless around their faces. Marcus's flashlight shook in his grip. His mouth had gone completely dry. Hey kids, you can't be in here. Where are your parents?" None of them moved. None of them spoke. They just stared at him with wide, unblinking eyes that seemed to catch the light like an animal's eyes, reflecting it back with an unnatural gleam. Marcus could see now that their feet were bare, covered in dirt and something darker. Their hands, clasped together in that unbroken chain, appeared bruised, the knuckles swollen. "Listen," Marcus tried again, taking an involuntary step backward. "I don't know how you got in here, but this building is unsafe. There's asbestos, structural damage. You need to leave right now, okay?" Still nothing. No reaction at all. They might have been statues, except that Marcus could see their chests rising and falling with breath. Slow, synchronized breaths, all 12 of them inhaling and exhaling in perfect unison.
And then, in perfect synchronization, they all smiled. It wasn't a child's smile. It wasn't friendly or mischievous or even particularly human. Their mouths stretched too wide, revealing teeth that seemed too numerous, too sharp. And in that moment, Marcus understood with crystalline certainty that whatever these things were, they weren't children. They were wearing children like masks, inhabiting them like houses, and now they were looking at him with hunger in those dead, reflecting eyes. Marcus ran. He didn't remember making the decision. His body just moved. Behind him came that pattering of bare feet, faster than children should run. Their laughter echoed off the walls, no longer joyful but manic, hungry. He hit the stairs at full speed, nearly tumbling down. His flashlight beam swung wildly, casting insane shadows. The front door was still open, moonlight streaming through. Marcus burst through it and didn't stop until he reached his patrol car, locking himself inside. "Jerry," he gasped into the radio, Jerry, we need to call the police. There are children in Mayflower. Something's wrong with them. Marcus, calm down. What are you talking about? I saw them, 12 kids. They were just standing there and then they chased me. Marcus, I'm looking at the camera feeds. You're the only person on the property. That's impossible. I saw... Listen carefully. Get in your car and drive to the main office right now. Marcus looked back at Mayflower. Every window was dark. The door was closed, though he didn't remember closing it. And there, in one second-floor window, he saw them, the children, pressed against the glass, watching him, watching and smiling. I'm leaving, Marcus whispered. He quit that same night. Jerry tried to convince him to stay, telling him that old buildings played tricks on the mind, that the stress of working alone at night could cause hallucinations. He even offered Marcus a raise, double his current pay, hazard pay, he called it. But Marcus knew what he'd seen. And he knew something else, too. Something that he'd noticed in those final seconds before he ran. The children's hospital gowns had been printed with a logo, the Pennhurst State School seal, and beneath that, dates. Birth dates and death dates. Every single one of those children had been dead for over 30 years. Marcus spent the next week researching Pennhurst's history. He found records of children who had died at the facility, hundreds over the decades. Many had been buried in unmarked graves on the property. Among those records, he found 12 names, 12 children who had all died on the same night in 1987, just months before the facility's closure. The official cause was listed as complications from influenza, but a newspaper article told a different story. A janitor had found them in one of the dormitories, all 12 dead in their beds, holding hands, no signs of illness, no marks. The incident was quietly buried in the chaos of the facility's impending shutdown. Those 12 children were buried together in a mass grave somewhere on the property. No headstone, no memorial. Marcus showed Jerry everything he'd found, including the dates. They matched perfectly. The real estate company eventually abandoned their plans to develop the site. They cited structural issues with the buildings, but the truth, according to Marcus, was simpler. After his report, 3 more security guards were hired to patrol the property. All 3 quit within a week. One of them was found the next morning sitting in his car in the parking lot, staring at the Mayflower building. When police asked him what happened, he could only say 5 words over and over. They wanted me to stay. Pennhurst remains empty today, officially closed to the public. But sometimes, late at night, residents of Spring City report hearing something strange drifting across the abandoned campus. The sound of children, singing, playing, laughing, waiting for someone else to join them. If you're still watching, I know you're hooked, but trust me, what you just heard is only the beginning. The next story takes us deep into the Pennsylvania wilderness, to a place where people go missing and the forest itself seems to be alive. But before we continue, if you haven't already subscribed to this channel, what are you waiting for? We dive into the darkest, most terrifying true stories every single week, and you don't want to miss what's coming next. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because the next story starts right now. Daniel Reeves was an experienced hiker. By the age of 32, he'd conquered portions of the Appalachian Trail, spent weeks camping in the Rockies, and prided himself on his survival skills and self-reliance. He'd grown up in suburban Pittsburgh, the youngest of 3 boys, and had always felt most at home in the wilderness. While his brothers went into business and finance, Daniel had become a freelance photographer, specializing in nature photography that took him deep into remote wilderness areas. He'd survived a thunderstorm on Mount Washington, had encountered black bears in the Smokies, and had once spent 3 days hiking out of a canyon in Utah after spraining his ankle. He was careful, competent, and confident in his abilities. When he decided to tackle a 3-day solo hike through Pennsylvania's Michaux State Forest in October 2021, he wasn't worried. He'd done his research.
studying topographical maps and reading trip reports from other hikers. The forest, covering nearly 86,000 acres in south-central Pennsylvania, was known for its beautiful fall foliage, abundant wildlife, and well-maintained trails. It wasn't particularly remote by wilderness standards. There were roads that cut through the forest, small towns on its borders, cell service in some areas. It should have been one of his easier adventures. He'd told his girlfriend Sarah exactly where he'd be and when to expect him back. He'd marked his planned route on GPS, packed extra food and water, and brought all his emergency gear, including a satellite phone he'd borrowed from a friend. Sarah had kissed him goodbye on October 15th, made him promise to check in if he got cell service, and told him she'd see him on the 18th. He was supposed to return on October 18th. He showed up on October 21st. Stumbling out of the forest 50 miles from where he'd entered, dehydrated, covered in scratches, and unable to explain what had happened to him. His satellite phone was missing. His backpack was gone, and his GPS device showed a trail log that made no logical sense. This is what he finally told police 3 days after his return, once he'd stopped shaking long enough to form coherent sentences. The first day had been perfect. Daniel hiked deep into the forest, setting up camp near a stream as sunset approached. He cooked dinner, filtered water, and settled into his tent as darkness fell. Through the mesh window, stars appeared in the deepening sky. The forest was alive with sound: crickets, owls, small animals foraging. Normal sounds. Safe sounds. He fell asleep easily, lulled by the stream and his exhaustion. He'd covered 12 miles that day. He woke around 2 a.m. to absolute silence. Any experienced outdoorsman knows that true silence in a forest is wrong. There's always something moving, breathing, alive. But when Daniel unzipped his tent, the world seemed to be holding its breath. No wind, no animals. Even the stream had gone quiet. The temperature had dropped significantly, frost already forming on fallen leaves. And then he heard it. A scream, high and piercing, coming from somewhere deep in the woods. Daniel grabbed his flashlight, his heart pounding. The scream came again, closer this time, and he realized it sounded almost human. Almost, but not quite. There was something off about the pitch, the way it seemed to echo and distort as it bounced between the trees. He stayed in his tent, his hand on the can of bear spray he always carried. The screaming continued for the next 20 minutes, sometimes distant, sometimes terrifyingly close, circling his campsite like a predator stalking prey. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The forest sounds gradually returned. Crickets, a distant owl, the babbling stream. Daniel didn't sleep the rest of that night. By morning, he'd convinced himself it had been an animal, maybe a fox. They could make remarkably human-like sounds when mating or fighting. Or a bobcat. Pennsylvania had those, though they were rare. He broke camp and continued hiking, determined not to let one unsettling night ruin his trip. He should have turned back. The second night, the screaming started earlier, just after sunset. Daniel had set up camp in a different area, miles from the first site, choosing a spot on higher ground that gave him better visibility of the surrounding forest. He'd convinced himself during the day's hike that the previous night had been an anomaly, maybe a fox or bobcat, animals that could produce surprisingly human-like sounds when mating or fighting. The rational part of his brain insisted there had to be a logical explanation. But the sound was identical. That same, not quite human shriek echoing through the trees, circling him. This time, he noticed something else.
In the beam of his flashlight, he could see the trees swaying as if something large was moving through them, pushing branches aside, disturbing the canopy. But there was no wind. No wind at all. The air was perfectly still, almost stagnant, carrying that same sharp chemical smell he'd noticed the night before, like formaldehyde mixed with rotting vegetation. "Hey!" he shouted into the darkness, trying to sound braver than he felt, trying to convince himself as much as whatever was out there. "I have bear spray! Stay back!"
The screaming stopped. For a moment, Daniel thought whatever was out there had been scared off, had recognized him as a threat, and decided to find easier prey. But then he heard something worse. Laughter, low and rasping, definitely not human, coming from the darkness just beyond his campfire's light. It wasn't the laughter of joy or amusement. It was the laughter of something that had just realized it had found what it was looking for. The laughter of a predator that had successfully cornered its prey. Daniel's hand tightened on his bear spray canister. He swept his flashlight across the tree line, but saw nothing. Just shadows and more shadows, the darkness seeming to press in against the small circle of light cast by his fire. He spent that night inside his tent with his knife in one hand and bear spray in the other, listening to something walking around his campsite. Not walking, exactly. Dragging. Like something heavy being pulled through the leaves and pine needles, leaving a trail that Daniel would see in the morning, a path of disturbed earth and broken vegetation that circled his tent exactly 7 times before leading off into the forest. It circled his tent for hours, getting closer and closer with each pass, until he could hear its breathing just outside the thin nylon wall. Deep, rattling breaths that sounded like they were coming from a chest filled with fluid, punctuated by wet clicking sounds that might have been a tongue or teeth. At one point, something pressed against the side of his tent, and Daniel could see the outline of what might have been a hand, though it had too many fingers, too many joints. The tent fabric stretched inward under the pressure, and Daniel scrambled backward, his breath coming in short gasps, certain that the thing was going to tear through the nylon and drag him out into the darkness. But it didn't. It just pressed there for what felt like an eternity, and then withdrew. The dragging sound resumed, circling, always circling. When dawn finally came, Daniel packed up his gear with shaking hands and checked his GPS. He was only about 8 miles from the nearest parking area. He could make it by afternoon if he pushed hard. He just had to get out of the forest. But the forest, it seemed, had other plans. Daniel hiked for 6 hours, following his GPS faithfully, but nothing looked familiar. The trail markers he'd passed on his way in were gone. Worse, he kept seeing the same landmarks over and over. A fallen tree with a distinctive V shape in its trunk, a boulder covered in bright green moss, a stream crossing that he could have sworn he'd passed 3 times already. He was going in circles. By the time the sun began to set on the 3rd day, Daniel was beginning to panic. His water was running low, his phone battery was nearly dead, and the screaming had started again, earlier this time, while there was still light in the sky. Multiple voices now, coming from all directions, surrounding him. He ran. Abandoning any pretense of following a trail, Daniel just ran, crashing through underbrush, tripping over roots, his lungs burning. The screaming followed him, always just behind, just out of sight. And now he could hear other sounds too, footsteps that matched his own, whispers in a language he didn't recognize, and that terrible dragging sound, getting closer and closer. He later learned he'd emerged from the forest 50 miles north of his entry point. The trucker who picked him up said he looked like he'd been to hell and back. His clothes were torn, his face covered in scratches, and his backpack was missing. But the worst part came when he finally checked his GPS device. According to the device's log, he'd hiked over 200 miles in those 3 days, circling the same central point over and over again. When park rangers investigated, they found his first campsite exactly where he'd indicated. His backpack was there, hanging from a tree branch 15 feet off the ground. Inside was his journal. The last entry, dated the 3rd night, read, "They won't let me leave."
Daniel insists he never wrote that. He'd lost his journal on the first night. The Pennsylvania Department of Conservation and Natural Resources officially attributes Daniel's experience to dehydration and exposure. They say he became disoriented, wandered off trail, and his mind filled in the gaps with hallucinations. But they can't explain the GPS data. They can't explain how his backpack ended up in a tree. And they definitely can't explain the other reports that have surfaced since Daniel came forward. 7 other hikers have reported similar experiences in Michaux State Forest over the past decade. Not all of them made it out. 3 are still missing, including an experienced outdoorsman named Marcus Webb, who vanished in 2019. The last message on his satellite phone simply read, "Can't hear screaming all around me, going in circles, something following." Local residents near the forest have a name for the area where Daniel emerged: the Screaming Woods. They say the land was cursed long before it became a state forest, that the Lenape tribes who originally inhabited the region considered it forbidden ground. They say something lives in those woods, something old and hungry that plays with its food before consuming it. Daniel Reeves doesn't hike anymore. He barely goes outside if he can help it. Because sometimes, late at night, he says he can still hear them. Those not quite human screams calling to him from somewhere far away. And he knows with absolute certainty that whatever was chasing him through those woods hasn't forgotten about him. He's just waiting for him to come back.
The Pritchard building in downtown Pittsburgh was scheduled for demolition in March 2023. Built in 1889, the 6-story structure had served various purposes over its long life. A textile factory during the industrial boom of the 1890s, a warehouse during the World Wars, office space during the economic resurgence of the 1950s, and, most recently, luxury lofts that had been marketed to young professionals in the early 2010s. Those lofts had been abandoned when the building failed a structural inspection in 2021, with engineers citing concerns about the foundation and load-bearing walls. The developer who owned the building decided it would be more cost-effective to tear it down and start fresh rather than attempt repairs. The demolition crew was brought in to tear it down and make way for a new high-rise development that would feature retail space, offices, and condominiums. It was supposed to be a straightforward job, the kind Jake Sullivan's company had done dozens of times before. Foreman Jake Sullivan had overseen countless demolitions in his 20-year career. He'd torn down factories, hospitals, schools, even a prison once. Old buildings didn't bother him. They were just brick and mortar, wood and steel, materials to be broken down and hauled away. He'd heard all the ghost stories, the warnings about disturbing the dead, the superstitions about buildings that didn't want to come down. He'd even had crew members quit over their fears, convinced that certain sites were cursed or haunted. Jake didn't believe any of it. He was a practical man who dealt in concrete realities: load calculations, safety protocols, demolition schedules. The Pritchard building should have been a straightforward job, 2 weeks max, maybe 3 if they ran into complications with hazardous materials or if the weather didn't cooperate. The building was structurally sound enough that they didn't need to worry about unexpected collapses, and the location in downtown Pittsburgh meant they had easy access for equipment and dump trucks. It ended up taking 3 months, and even then they never finished it. The trouble started on the very first day. Jake's crew began on the top floor, working their way down as per standard procedure. They'd removed most of the 6th floor's interior walls when one of the workers, a young guy named Tommy Chen, called Jake over to look at something. "Boss, you gotta see this," Tommy said, pointing his flashlight at the exterior wall they'd just exposed. In the old brick, revealed after they'd torn away the drywall and insulation, there was a face. Not a decorative element or architectural feature, an actual face molded into the brick itself. Hollow eyes with distinct pupils, a gaping mouth frozen in a silent scream, hands pressed against the surface as if trying to push through from the other side. You could see fingernails, the creases in the palms, even individual teeth in that screaming mouth. "Weird artistic choice," Jake muttered, though something about the face made his skin crawl. "Must be from the original construction. Rich people in the 1800s had strange taste." "Jake," Tommy said slowly, "there's more." There were 17 faces on that wall alone, all of them screaming, all of them pressed against the brick as if they'd been trapped inside it. Some were adult-sized, their mouths stretched impossibly wide. Others were much smaller. One appeared to be a child,
its tiny hand splayed on either side of its anguished face. Jake reported the find to the demolition company's owner, who contacted the developer, who called in a historian from the University of Pittsburgh. Dr. Elena Martinez arrived the next day with a team of graduate students, cameras, and a growing sense of unease. "I've never seen anything like this," she admitted after examining the wall. "There's no record of decorative faces in the building's original plans, and the style is wrong. These aren't carved or molded after construction. They look like..." She trailed off, reluctant to voice what everyone was thinking. "Like they were made from the inside," Jake finished quietly. Dr. Martinez spent 3 days photographing and documenting the faces before giving Jake's crew permission to continue. But as they worked their way down through the building, they found more. Every exterior wall, once exposed, revealed dozens of faces. By the time they reached the 3rd floor, Jake had stopped counting. There had to be hundreds, maybe thousands.
And then the accidents started. The first was minor. A worker named David Rodriguez tripped over his own feet and fell down a flight of stairs, breaking his ankle. Unfortunate, but it happened on construction sites. The second accident occurred 2 days later, when a section of ceiling collapsed unexpectedly, nearly crushing 2 workers. That was more concerning, but old buildings were unpredictable. The third accident was different. Jake was working on the 2nd floor when he heard the screaming. Not the screaming of someone hurt, but the screaming of someone who had seen something that broke their mind. He ran toward the sound and found one of his crew, Lisa Warren, standing in a room, staring at a freshly revealed wall, covered in faces. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, so densely packed they seemed to overlap. She was screaming and clawing at her own face hard enough to draw blood. "Lisa! Lisa, what's wrong?" She didn't seem to hear him. Her eyes were locked on the wall, wide and unblinking, tears streaming down her face. Blood from the scratches on her cheeks dripped onto her work shirt. She'd stopped screaming now, but her mouth was still open in that scream shape. Jake grabbed her shoulders, tried to turn her away from the wall, but she fought him with surprising strength. It took 3 men to finally restrain her and carry her out of the building. By the time they got her outside, her eyes were unfocused, distant. She kept mumbling something under her breath. Jake leaned in close to hear. "They want out," Lisa was whispering. "They want out! They want out! They want out!" She was hospitalized that same day. The doctors called it a psychotic break brought on by stress. But Lisa had been one of his most stable workers, not prone to anxiety or panic. When Jake visited her at the hospital, she grabbed his hand with desperate strength. "Don't finish it," she begged. "Don't tear down that building, Jake. If you do, you'll let them out." "Let who out?" "The faces. They're not brick, Jake. They're people. And they're still alive in there." Jake stopped the demolition the next day. He told his crew to take a few days off while he figured things out. But the truth was, he didn't know what to do. Lisa's words had gotten under his skin, ridiculous as they were. Faces couldn't be people. The building was just brick and mortar. But that night, alone in his office, he couldn't stop thinking about those faces. The way they all seemed to be screaming. The way their expressions showed not just fear, but agony, as if they'd been suffering for a very, very long time. He decided to do some research. The Pritchard building, he learned, had been built by industrialist Cornelius Pritchard in 1889. Pritchard had made his fortune in textiles, but he'd also been known for something else: his fascination with occult practices and secret societies. Several contemporary accounts described him as a practicing alchemist who claimed to have discovered the secret to immortal life. Cornelius Pritchard had disappeared in 1891, just 2 years after his building was completed. The official story was that he'd left Pittsburgh to pursue business opportunities in Europe, but he was never heard from again. His building passed through several owners before eventually being abandoned. Jake dug deeper. He found newspaper archives from 1889, articles about the building's construction, and buried in the back pages, he found something that made his blood run cold. During the building's construction, 11 workers had gone missing.
The disappearances were never solved, though some suspected they'd simply left town to find work elsewhere, as laborers often did in that era. 11 missing workers, thousands of faces in the walls. Jake went back to the building that night alone. He shouldn't have, but he had to know. He had to see those faces one more time, had to confirm that what Lisa said was impossible. He made his way to the second floor with just his flashlight. The exposed walls seemed to watch him as he approached. In the beam of his light, the faces looked even more disturbing, their features twisted in genuine agony. Jake reached out and touched one of the faces.
The brick was warm. Jake snatched his hand back. Brick shouldn't be warm in an unheated building in March at 2 a.m. He touched another face, then another, all warm, almost body temperature, with a faint pulsing beneath the surface, like a heartbeat, like dozens of hearts beating out of sync. And then one of the faces moved, just slightly, just enough that Jake might have convinced himself he'd imagined it if his heart hadn't been hammering so hard. The face's mouth opened wider, just a fraction of an inch, and Jake heard something. A whisper, barely audible, coming from somewhere deep inside the wall. "Help us!" The voice was followed by others, a chorus rising from the walls around him. "Help us! Please help us! Let us out! We've been here so long!" Jake's flashlight fell from his trembling hand. In the moving shadows, he saw the faces changing, their mouths opening wider, their hands pressing harder against the brick. They were trying to break through, trying to push their way out. Jake ran. He ran faster than he'd ever run in his life, down the stairs, through the lobby, out into the street. He got on his truck and drove straight to the demolition company's office, where he quit on the spot. He refused to explain why, refused to go back to the building even to collect his tools. He just quit and never looked back. The demolition was eventually completed by a different crew. They reported no unusual incidents. By August 2023, the Pritchard building was gone, replaced with an empty lot. But then the problem started with the lot itself. Construction crews refused to work there. They reported hearing whispers from underground, seeing shadows that moved against the light, feeling watched by unseen eyes. 3 separate construction companies walked away from the project. The lot remains empty today. And sometimes, according to people who live nearby, if you walk past that lot late at night, you can hear it. Thousands of voices whispering, screaming, begging to be set free. Jake Sullivan lives in Ohio now. He changed careers, works in an office, won't set foot on a construction site, because he knows the truth that no one else wants to acknowledge. Whatever Cornelius Pritchard did in that building, whatever dark alchemy he practiced, he found a way to trap people, to preserve them somehow in brick and mortar, keeping them alive but imprisoned for over a century. And when the building came down, when those walls were finally destroyed, those people, those souls, they didn't die. They didn't find peace. They just moved. Into the ground. Into the earth beneath that lot. Waiting. Always waiting. For someone to build something new on that spot so they can spread further. So they can find new walls to inhabit. New prisons to call home. The Pritchard building is gone, but what it contained, what it was built to hold, is still there. Still hungry. Still screaming silently beneath the streets of Pittsburgh, in walls and foundations and underground spaces we can't see. And every time someone builds something new in that city, Jake wonders, could this be it? Could this be the building that finally lets them out? 3 stories, 3 places, 3 warnings that Pennsylvania holds secrets darker than most people could imagine. Pennhurst's ghostly children, still playing their eternal games in abandoned halls. The screaming woods of Michaux, where the forest itself hungers for those who enter. And the Pritchard building, whose demolition didn't end the nightmare, but merely moved it underground. These aren't just stories designed to scare you. They're reminders that history leaves scars, that some places hold on to their tragedies, and that the line between our world and whatever lies beyond is thinner than we'd like to believe.
If you made it this far, you're exactly the kind of viewer this channel needs. Someone who isn't afraid to stare into the darkness and ask what's staring back. Next week, I'm taking you somewhere even more terrifying. A place where an entire town vanished overnight, and the only clues left behind were warnings scrawled on every wall, every window, every surface in the same 3 words. Don't look outside. You're not going to want to miss that one. So here's what I need you to do. Subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss a single upload. Drop a like on this video if these stories got under your skin, and leave a comment telling me which story disturbed you the most, because I read every single one and your feedback helps shape future content. Until next time, remember, the darkness is patient, and it's always closer than you think. Sleep tight, if you can.